Ethiopia has been engaged in a civil war with an insurrectionist ethnic minority army, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, for well over a year. The US supported the TPLF politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily throughout its 27-year tyrannical rule of the entire country, beginning in 1991. In exchange, the TPLF offered its army in service to the US agenda in Africa. In 2018, popular uprisings finally ousted the TPLF. Today, we're speaking with Billene Seyoum, feminist poet and Ethiopia's foreign press secretary. Billene Seyoum, thanks for speaking with Pacifica's COVID Race and Democracy. After that CNN interview last week, I wouldn't be surprised if you never wanted to speak to any US press again.
And thank you so much for having me, and any opportunity for a constructive engagement is always welcome from our side, and I do not have any doubt that we will be having that kind of a conversation with you.
Would you mind if I nevertheless play just a bit of that CNN aggression so our listeners will have an idea of what we're talking about?
Sure, let's go ahead.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you for joining us. A year since the start of Ethiopia's conflict, yet we are seeing armed groups fighting your government increasing as numbers as they advance towards the capital. What's happening on the ground, and how far are the TPLF and other allies from Addis Ababa?
Becky, thank you so much for having me. Before I answer your question, it would be quite disingenuous of me to respond to your question without first addressing the big elephant in the room. And it's important for me to share with you, as well as your global audience, that Ethiopians, a majority of Ethiopians in Ethiopia as well as abroad, strongly feel that CNN has covered the conflict over the past year in a manner that is highly biased and detached from context. And a recent example is the hysteria that CNN had caused last week as if Addis Ababa was under siege, sending a global message that the city is about to go down. And we have often shared that it seems Ethiopia is undergoing what seems like a coordinated media campaign to tarnish the image of the country, to tarnish the image of the Prime Minister and his administration. And media outlets like CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, and Reuters in particular, as well as others, have often chosen to carry an overly negative and skewed narrative, missing important nuances. And I reiterate this to you because I also heard the opening lines, which really takes away or is devoid of assigning the actual blame where it is, assigning the blame to the TPLF that initiated this conflict. And they have also given testimony and confessed that they're the ones that attacked the Northern Command of the National Defense Forces.
Right.
So I think it's important.
Let me respond to your words, because I've given you a chance to say your bit. Our work, our reporting was conducted carefully and methodically by CNN's highly experienced team in the region and elsewhere. We stand by its findings as well as the language used in our reporting, which we believe is fully justified.
Just to put things colloquially for listeners who don't know much about this subject, that CNN anchor Becky Anderson wanted to know when Ethiopia's capital would hurry up and fall to the US-backed Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. That should have gotten a big fat F in Journalism 101. And I know CNN's been in the lead in slandering your government, but what do you think of the rest of the Western press coverage?
Thank you, Anne. I mean, at this moment, there is really no fun interview because predominantly over the past year, a lot of Western media have already framed the issue. And so you have a tendency for other follow-up media to also kind of dish out from the same bowl. But I don't want to make the mistake of lumping all Western media in the same bin, as there are a handful, and I would say a handful, that do try to get the context right. But predominant coverage, like I was saying, of mainstream Western media has been one-sided to the extent that it makes one believe that there is a concerted negative propaganda campaign against Ethiopia and the Prime Minister specifically. So now your listeners may be interested to know which are the common areas of negative campaigning and propaganda that I strongly feel has been dominating a lot of Western media. And there's a number of them, but to begin with, for example, there's this overarching narrative of the Nobel Peace Prize laureate gone rogue on peace.
Oh, yeah.
And this is such a damaging and patronizing narrative, because it doesn't put into perspective, or it only starts highlighting what has happened within the country as of November 3rd, when the TPLF attacked the Northern Command of the National Defense Forces. It doesn't put into perspective the lengths that the Prime Minister had gone over the past 3 years prior to the November 3rd attacks, to engage in dialogue with the TPLF, to encourage their leadership, to participate in the political spaces that are opening up. It doesn't put into perspective the efforts by the government as well to ensure that the platforms that were created were inclusive, and onboarding them in that process as well. So the way that that narrative has been skewed, and the personification of everything on the Prime Minister, is quite puzzling. The second one, in terms of misinformation that the Western media has been propagating, is again the personification that the Prime Minister attacked the Tigray region. Again, there's evidence, and they're on record, on the senior leadership of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, saying that they have undertaken a preemptive attack. Granted that they said it in a language that is not in English, but there hasn't been any effort from international media, particularly Western media, to really dig into that. So a year on later into this altercation, you're still seeing that same narrative being perpetrated again and again, and misinforming a global audience. The third one that I want to raise is this aspect of portraying the TPLF as a victim, and not really understanding the true nature of the TPLF. I think for a majority of the world, the point in time in which they've started knowing who TPLF is as of November 3rd, because of the way that it has been spun. So nobody understands that the TPLF have been a small clique that have been ruling Ethiopia the 27 years preceding the Prime Minister coming to the premiership in 2018. And the nature of the way that they had been ruling Ethiopia, the divisive nature along ethnic cleavages, magnifying these divisions, the vast human rights abuses that are documented, the killing, the economic sabotage and the corruption that this group, when you look at where Ethiopia could have been if there was a strong and solid government that had been holding it for the past 7 years, it's really heartbreaking. So again, the way that international media is portraying TPLF as a victim of a federal government is a very erroneous and misleading agenda, and it's a betrayal to the people of Ethiopia who've been subjugated to the oppressive reign of TPLF. A fourth one that I want to bring up again alongside this is this aspect of the nation is disintegrating. So this alarmist narrative that you're seeing being spewed, particularly over the past 3 weeks, that this has been an incremental approach that has been utilized again in this concerted orchestration. So, the nation is disintegrating, dissuading, investments, disencouraging people to come in and understand what the actual context is. And then the current alarmism that had been propagated by, as you had rightly pointed, CNN, saying that Addis Ababa is under siege, creating a sense of panic within the nation, and the way that international audiences are looking at Ethiopia. A fifth element, and I'm wrapping up on this aspect, is again magnifying or pushing a TPLF narrative that ethnic cleansing, ethnic profiling, and genocide is taking place. Now, for anybody, for somebody who's been following a lot of these international media outlets before as key information outlet, it's very disheartening for me to see that international reporting and journalism is kind of at a threat because of the very sensational way that the Ethiopian conflict has been documented over the past year. And I say this because on November 3rd, bordering on November 4th, the TPLF attacked the Northern Command, a treasonous attack on the National Defense Forces. And this is a Northern Command that had been stationed within the Tigray region for 20 years, protecting the people of Tigray, supporting them, or supporting farming communities when farming time had come in, fighting desert locusts, and so, doing a lot of things. So when they had attacked the Northern Command by that point in time, by November 4th, you would see that they were already, their digital wing in the western part of the world, predominantly in the US and in the UK, had already started trending a hashtag on social media, particularly on Twitter, declaring Tigray genocide. So at that point in time that they had struck the National Defense Forces within the Tigray region, the rest of the National Defense Forces were not even within the Tigray region. So you can see that this was orchestrated, and while the government was caught off guard, this narrative was already being developed. And now we have a lot of international media and respectable, or what used to be respectable and reputable international media and their senior anchors perpetuating this narrative of, genocide and ethnic cleansing that's happening in the country, which is absolutely untrue. And the recent UN report, Human Rights, together with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission that was undertaken, also ruled that out. So these things are not, told as much as they need to be, yet the propaganda is something that is being pushed. And then finally, again, the sixth element that I was telling you about is this aspect of Addis Ababa being under siege, that TPLF is battle hardened, so, they're going to take over. But if you see the history of TPLF, this is the same narrative that was being used by international media, that was being used by TPLF and their allies when they were coming into the other parts of the country 30 years ago, when they were engaged in this kind of a battle with the previous regime, the Derg socialist regime as well. So it's like a playbook of what they had done the last time as well, which at that point in time, because there wasn't social media and there wasn't an active, citizen journalist component to it, a lot of the propaganda had not been pushed back, but it was the tactics that they were using, building up this image of strength and saying, we're going to take over Addis, when even at that point in time, 30 years ago, they were not even close to Addis. Yet they created so much panic that, the government became porous at that point in time. So they're using the same tactics again, and they have their helpers within international media and international spaces that are also fanning these flames of Addis being under siege, the vicinity being under siege, and that it's a foregone conclusion that the PLF are going to be entering. So the psychological warfare against Ethiopians is something that is being fanned again on international media spaces, issuing full statements from the government, also sharing full interviews that they have undertaken, because there's a lot of people that are being interviewed to give the information from the government side, and silencing of pro-Ethiopian voices as well on mainstream media spaces. So I really think that real credible media outlets and journalists who are still believe in the ethics of journalism have a responsibility to expose this criminal enterprise and its allies for what they are.
Can you tell the story of the disappearing trucks and the narrative around that?
Yeah, I mean, that narrative is quite interesting because within the first, until June 2021, until the end of June, the Ethiopian government was the one that was taken on the burden or the responsibility. It has to be a responsibility from the government's end of providing humanitarian assistance to the people of Tigray. At that point in time, the humanitarian needs were obviously concentrated within the region. And so up to 70% was being provided by the government, and partner organizations were merely providing 30% of assistance, yet they occupied 70% of the space in terms of pushing for humanitarian assistance, saying that nothing is being reached there. So in end of June 2021, the federal government enacted a humanitarian ceasefire, a unilateral humanitarian ceasefire, because the other side, quote unquote, depicted this or portrayed this as a sick joke. That's what they referred to it as. Yet in Ethiopia, the rainy season begins around June and it goes on until September. So that is critical for farming communities, and particularly because the Tigray region, prior to the conflict starting, is a food insecure region. They've always been on food assistance because it's a very harsh environment. So the area in which farming communities would have to produce to ensure that, because the previous year as well, due to desert locusts, farming communities have been heavily affected. And with the conflict the following year, it was essential and part of government responsibility to ensure that the farmers within Tigray would, have a break from what was happening and negatively affecting them, so that they could go about their farming activities. Yet the National Defense Forces withdrew from the Tigray region, and what we witnessed rather is, instead of the TPLF taking this as a token of peace and ensuring that the people of Tigray, in whose name they say that they're standing up for, yet in whose name they're trading for their political agenda. Instead of taking that, they rather mobilized, citizens within the region to go and attack neighboring communities in the Afar region, which is neighboring, and also in the Amhara region. So at that point in time, the potential, having gone into the second wave of humanitarian assistance and with more humanitarian actors getting engaged, the potential for them to enter into the Tigray region was being hampered, because for the propaganda machinery of TPLF, they wanted to portray that the government was not enabling humanitarian assistance and suffocating its people from food provisions for critical communities and beneficiaries. So these tactics were employed at that point in time. But on occasion, when these trucks have been going in, and now initially it was about 400 or so that had not returned, and the recent data is now over 800 trucks that had entered the Tigray region and were not returning back. Yet the pressure by international organizations, again echoing this aspect of humanitarian assistance is not being allowed by Ethiopia, was louder, yet nobody is addressing the big elephant in the room, that these trucks were going in and were not coming back out. And at one point in time, the UN office in Ethiopia had issued a statement on social media saying that in order for humanitarian assistance, for their assistance to be effective within the region, the trucks needed to return, and that they were encountering this challenge of the trucks not returning as well. Now on the TPLF side, and what a lot of international media took up is that, fuel, they were only fueled with enough to take them into the region, but not come back out. And that was absolutely fabricated, because what we've seen in a lot of imagery and photographs and utilizing their own media spaces, what we've seen is that the trucks were being used to transport fighters outside from the Tigray region, taking them into the other regions in which that they were attacking. So the siphoning off of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid for fighters, taking it away from the real beneficiaries who needed it, and also hijacking, the trucks and the modes of transport that were supposed to enable humanitarian assistance to flow within the region, was being hijacked by the TPLF for its own agenda and encroachment and belligerence into other regions.
China and Russia's English language press have encouraged Ethiopia and suggested that the US back off. Could you say something about Ethiopia's collaborative business relationships with China and Russia?
Ethiopia has long-standing, as an ancient country, Ethiopia has got long-standing relations with various countries throughout the world. And in particular, it also has trade ties with China and Russia, in addition to other trade ties with other countries. As it pertains to China, China is one of Ethiopia's key development partners, with many productive investments by various Chinese businesses that are operating in various sectors. A key demonstration of that has been in infrastructure development as one key area of cooperation. And Ethiopia-China relations have also grown over the years in great leaps, and they've expanded in many fields, including the economy, politics, security, technology transfer, academia, and capacity building. And also with Ethiopia being an active participant in the China's proposed Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global development plan that involves infrastructure development and trade and investment facilitation aimed at boosting connectivity on a transcontinental level. Ethiopia's cooperation with China has also improved the country's infrastructure and strengthened its industrial establishments in that regard. When you look at with Russia, as it pertains to Russia, similarly, the relations between the two countries are also quite historic. Ethiopia acknowledges Russia as a key partner in our development endeavors. In terms of trade relations and businesses, the Russian Federation, for example, supplies Ethiopia with the mineral fertilizers, and Ethiopia as a key or one of the key drivers of the economy being agriculture. Ethiopia has engaged in exports of agricultural products like coffee, oilseed, pulses, vegetables, and flowers. So with both of these countries, as well as with other countries, there is room for further enhanced trade ties.
But Ethiopians would actually like to be friends with the American people, wouldn't they? I mean, I often say it's just an oligarchy that is advancing this warmongering policy.
It's not only that Ethiopians would like to have friendly ties with the United States. There are a lot of, actually, a predominant number of Ethiopians in the diaspora reside within the US as well. So there is that close tie already. As a government, Ethiopia has always considered the United States government as one of the most important strategic partners in all-rounded efforts towards achieving lasting peace, democracy, and prosperity for the people. Bilateral relations and cooperation have been expanded and also deepened over the years in many fields, just like they have been done so with many other countries as well. And again, this is the official position of the government, is that Ethiopia stands ready to work closely with the US government in further strengthening bilateral relations based on mutual respect and understanding. And understanding of our context and complexity of the current issues that Ethiopia is faced with. But I think by way of, the conversation with you, I think the American people also deserve to know that any pressure on sovereign countries like Ethiopia through ill-informed policy decisions is set to backfire. As an uncolonized, nation, many Ethiopians are feeling that there is undue pressure and condemnation of the state, of the government, that is asserting its territorial integrity, and that is what it has been doing over the past year. So this equalizing of, an insurgent terrorist organization, a terrorist organization that has been designated as such by our House of People's representatives in a constitutional process, equalizing them with a democratically elected government, and this is the first democratic election that has taken place in Ethiopia, with the unwavering, majority support for the current ruling party, the Prosperity Party. So that is engaged in preserving its territorial integrity, ensuring peace and security within the country. That should be the basis of partnership, because the U.S. itself, on several occasions, has also dealt with its own threats to terrorism, and Ethiopia has also been a champion of that as well. So for the Ethiopian people, when there are these kind of groups that are threatening the unity of the country, that are threatening the very fabric of, ways to be Ethiopian, then we do seek for, long-term partners to understand where we are coming from and also stand beside us.
Okay, everyone has been reporting on this civil war, but I'd like to ask you about Ethiopia's enormous potential, starting with its agricultural potential. Although Ethiopia is in most Western minds associated with the word famine, I believe you have abundant arable land, much of it uncultivated. What are your plans for developing it and achieving national food security?
So indeed, Ethiopia is endowed with a abundant arable land that has not been much utilized. I was mentioning to you earlier that agriculture is the backbone of the national economy, with many livelihoods throughout the country that are dependent on agriculture. Much of the practice has been reliant on subsistence farming and employing traditional methods of farming. Also, many parts of the country, I also said that earlier, are food insecure, not because of lack of land and ability for farming productivity, but because our agriculture sector has been dependent on subsistence farming for far too long. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his administration, as of 2018, have been greatly committed to modernizing the sector, and hence agriculture remains at the center of development policy. Among many of the reforms that had been undertaken by the Prime Minister in the past 3 years, one of the key ones has been for modernizing, in order to modernize the agriculture sector, has been waiving duties and taxes on machineries and spare parts to be used in the sector. So this has made modern equipment, including tractors, available to farmers, enhancing their productivity in the move from ox-driven farming techniques to utilization of modern equipment and tractors. And another key initiative spearheaded by the Prime Minister is the piloting of wheat farming in lowland areas through irrigation systems, whereas there was predominantly the agricultural focus had been on highland areas. Now, through enhancing irrigation productivity, also testing wheat production in these lowland areas. And there has been great success that has been demonstrated in the past 2 years. So there will be a building up of this attempt by continuing on this path. And, through these initiatives in a few years, the administration does believe that Ethiopia can claim to ensure food security. Another aspect, again, of enhancing food security has been the cluster farming approach that has been further accelerated within the past 3 years. And in the cluster farming approach, instead of, because predominantly they're smallholder farmers, instead of just individual farms, producing, what is being done is, by following a cluster approach, farmers are coming together, bringing their resources, bringing their lands together for collective success. And this is an embodiment of the Madamar principle that the Prime Minister has championed, which is this aspect of synergy, bringing resources together for collective development.
Is it true that everyone who voted in the election planted a tree?
Well, on election day, June 21st, 2021, part of the mobilization that was done is you go out, you cast your vote, because this is the first time, honestly, and that people in Ethiopia had gone out democratically en masse to cast their vote. And as I was sharing with you earlier, June is the beginning of the rainy season. So in many parts of the country where it was, raining so much, people were still in line saying that they will not go back home. In fact, many of the polling stations had extended, because polling stations were closing at 6 p.m. Local time. And they had to extend by another 6 hours because people were like, no, we want to keep on casting our votes. So people were lined up in the cold, in the dark, in the rain until midnight wanting to cast their vote. So alongside that, there was an initiative of, planting. The Green Legacy Initiative was something that was introduced by the Prime Minister in 2019. And the ambition was within a 4-year period to plant 20 billion seedlings. And there has been a progressive encouragement and push and uptake nationally to ensure that this planting continues, not just for reforestation and afforestation purposes, but also as part of ensuring food security, because some of these seedlings that are being planted are also edible plants.
Have you had to respond to land grabbing efforts by the big multinational agricultural corporations, like those crippling so many African nations?
So land grabs actually were a key feature of the previous regime that was led by TPLF. There were a lot of unethical dealings in terms of the utilization of land in the 27 years that TPLF was in control. So this was a clear problem where multinationals were awarded significant land and with the expectation that they would develop it, with just holding onto the land, and no development came out of it. So again, going back to some of the key reforms that had been instituted when the Prime Minister came to the premiership in 2018 is a reassessment and further evaluation of the capacities of these multinationals who had been provided licenses for these lands, and revocation of them based on the assessments that have made, because a review of the licenses that had been provided by the TPLF showed that there were a lot of shady investment agreements. So in that regard, a part of the reforms was to assess and return the land back into government for a productive capacity. So it's not a problem in the past 3 years. In fact, the government focus has been to expand commercial farming without the impact on land grabbing. So, I mean, it's inevitable that to ensure food security, we have to move away from subsistence farming to commercial farming. But there is specific efforts that are being made that we do this without losing sight of corporations who are aiming to engage in land grabs.
I know you have enormous hydropower potential, most of all in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, but also on rivers that aren't even tributary to the Blue Nile. Could you talk about your plans to develop more hydropower and possibly using it to irrigate your abundant arable land resource?
The GERD is a lifeline to Ethiopians. It's going to be upon completion, and now it's almost near completion. It will be one of the largest dams within the continent, and if not the 7th largest dam in the world. And the primary benefit of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, is to produce hydroelectricity with the generation capacity of 6,000 megawatts, and this means about $1 billion revenue per year. What that revenue means in terms of transforming, predominantly agriculture-dominated economy and livelihoods that are dependent on that is huge. The energy generation also provides an opportunity to boost Ethiopia's national energy generation, increase regional energy availability. So it's not only about production for Ethiopia's purposes, but it would also have surplus to be able to light up, neighboring countries as well, despite the way that it's being skewed negatively. It also means integration, share of renewable energy, and contribution to climate change mitigation as well. 70% of households within Ethiopia, and this is a country of 100 plus million people, as I was saying, live without electricity. And electricity is crucial to build the economy, to build the aspirations that have been laid out in Ethiopia's homegrown economic reform agenda that we embarked upon 3 years ago, as well as the 10-year National Perspective Plan, which looks at productivity of a lot of sectors. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the lifeline for a lot of Ethiopians, because they've also put their money into it. This is an initiative that has come about by Ethiopians putting in their own money into their own development aspirations. So this is a key project. As well, there are also other hydroelectric generation capacities throughout the country, like you have mentioned. So there is a plan to develop along these other rivers as well, to ensure that there's support for our agricultural productivity as well as generation of electricity throughout the country.
Africa is plagued by kleptocratic governments, many of which have been violently installed by the US and European powers, usually by proxy. These governments typically let foreign corporations rob their own people so long as they get their cut. And most contracts to extract African resources are highway robbery. Is the Abiy government committed to using Ethiopia's natural resources to uplift the entire population and end widespread poverty?
Oh, definitely. This is a key hallmark of the current administration, again, championed by the Prime Minister. And the reason that I say that is, again, learning from, the trials and tribulations of so many communities that have experienced, incorrect policies or corrupt policies. Have implemented on regions during the TPLFs era. The focus of this administration has been to ensure inclusive, equitable, and sustainable development with a focus on multiple areas. So when it comes to resources, as we were saying, there's resources that we have always been aware of, but over the past 3 years, many Ethiopians are also becoming even much more aware of their natural endowments, and that we're not a poor nation. There's so much that has not been utilized for the prosperity of the people, but we are not a poor nation, and there's so much that the Ethiopian people can develop to utilize for their growth and development. So in terms of what has been done, yes, we don't want to fall in the same trap as many other countries where resources are seen or are become a resource curse. We don't want to be the country that suffers from that resource curse. So the focus on developing natural resources has been done with a focus on paying heed that it has to be inclusive, that it has to be sustainable, and it has to be an added value for communities. So if you look at, for example, gold mining, there's licenses that have been revoked for not paying attention to local communities. Yet now, over the past year, for example, gold export gains for Ethiopia have been really, really strong, and has been one of the earners of foreign currency. And this has been because of the commitment to ensure that gold mining has been community-based by developing community-based resource development programs, where communities are also the direct beneficiaries of this. So there is intentional way of ensuring that resources are being utilized in an equitable manner nationally, and this is something that we're going to be building upon as the reforms progress.
Ethiopia would like to have a good relationship with the United States, wouldn't it? The American people have nothing against your prime minister or government. And if they understood US aggression against Ethiopia, I'm sure they'd oppose it.
But I believe you're being hit hard by President Biden's cancellation of your eligibility for the Preferential Trade Agreement, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA. Could you talk about the consequences of that?
Well, I mean, AGOA, the AGOA privileges that Ethiopia has been part of has primarily benefited impoverished women because the industries in which, and now you'll have to see with Ethiopia's industrialization moves towards industrialization, and a lot of industry parks that have been come in, a majority of jobs had been created, and a lot of women are in the textile and manufacturing area, in which these companies have eligibility to AGOA. So the impact of removing Ethiopia or delisting Ethiopia from AGOA is going to directly impact these women. There's about 80% of women who are working in this sector, and it's not only going to affect them as the hundreds of thousands of women that are employed in the sector, but as you know, women's roles within their communities and within their families is multidimensional. So they end up supporting households. So their income is not only an income that they have started to generate to support themselves as individuals, but in the communal way that Ethiopian communities and African communities exist, there are households that we think about, and households are anywhere between 5 to 6 individuals within there. So this is directly impacting the women who have rural women who have had no opportunities before, who for whom this opening up of industries has enabled them to gain confidence, to usually escape underage marriages, to also have the potential to develop themselves and also their communities and their families. So that trigger has got a domino effect that really needs to be thought about. And like I was saying earlier, the engagement that Ethiopia wants with its partners is a constructive engagement. It cannot be one that is affecting the livelihoods of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians. And I personally believe that sanctions are an outdated mode of engagement, particularly as countries like Ethiopia are developing and are developed in many aspects. The engagement should be on a constructive engagement and not a carrotistic methodology that predominantly is going to be affecting the most vulnerable sections of our populations. So this needs to be also really rethought. And, again, this is a message to the American audience to also really question these kind of approaches. But in terms of what Ethiopians are doing, again, I was telling you that over the past year, there has been marks of resilience of the economy. So there are different measures that the government is going to be putting in place. But I would also like to say how the role of the diaspora communities of Ethiopian diaspora, globally is key to sustaining Ethiopia's growth and development, because international remittances are one of the key currency earners for the country as well. And we know that Ethiopians throughout the world are with Ethiopians within the country as well. And again, building on that fervor and that energy of resilience, there is a lot of effort that is being mobilized by the diaspora community. So it's going to be not only government spearheaded, but this is going to be a whole countrywide and Ethiopians' wide effort to ensure that the track that we have embarked upon 3 years ago is something that is sustained.
Okay, lastly, tell us about the potential of the alliance between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, which makes the US uneasy, to say the least.
So I don't know who's uneasy about this, but as far as alliances between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, it's not something that is only contained to the three countries. Since the Prime Minister has come into the premiership in 2018, and I was mentioning to you his concept of Madamar, which is synergy, was not limited to the nation as well. It's something that extended to the Horn region, and by way of that is also a launching pad for continental integration. So the Prime Minister has been working aggressively on regional integration, and this is not regional integration is not unique for Ethiopia or the Horn region. If you do remember, post World War, European countries had also come together because they found that, coming together economically and politically strengthened them and enabled, them to bypass some of the challenges that had come post-war. So this, the development or the birth of the EU is something that was around the same basis on which the Prime Minister is also advocating for regional integration or Horn region integration based on the economy and political integration at some point in time. So Ethiopia is adapting to that situation, and it shouldn't be seen as a threat that these countries within the Horn region, East Africa, and then overall at the continental level are coming together because again, instead of reliance on outside forces, a lot of African countries, a lot of Horn region countries are taking the perspective that their issues and their challenges are their own. And by coming together, they are able to resolve a lot of these challenges.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. And I think just as a final message to your listeners and to the American public at large is to really rethink the narratives that have been, spun around Ethiopia. and the Ethiopian government as well. The Ethiopian government, particularly this administration, like no other administration before, has been a government or an administration that has been preaching or calling for peace, for unity for the past 3 years. The nature of the insurgent group has been to spew, hateful rhetoric and propaganda against the current administration to cover up for the ills and to cover up for the crimes that they have committed over the past 27 years. So I think a lot of audiences need to raise themselves above the mainstream media rhetoric and really determine what is true, split, or start separating the wheat from the chaff in terms of what is happening in Ethiopia. And there is still great potential. Ethiopians, are proud of their country as an uncolonized nation, as a resilient nation and as a resilient people. Ethiopians throughout the world, in Ethiopia and outside of Ethiopia, are committed to transforming their country. And the path that we've embarked upon the past 3 years, as cumbersome and as problematic as it is, will definitely start bearing the fruits that it is entitled to.
Thank you again, Billene Seyoum, for speaking to Pacifica's COVID, Race, and Democracy.
Thank you so much, Anne.